All right. And in 3 or 2, or we don't know, but yes, right about then, we are live or not live. We're privately live.
Privately live.
Privately live.
We live in the live.
We're living the live. We're living that live
There
life.
we go, in the present, right here.
Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having
Thanks
me.
for repeating as a guest.
Oh,
and,
yeah. Time has passed.
Yeah.
Stories have changed. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Before last time you were here, obviously, you were gearing up for the regional competition.
Absolutely.
And
that ended anticlimactically.
I don't know about anticlimactically.
Okay, that's true.
But it was definitely not what you probably envisioned as the climax.
Right. I think it became the beginning of a completely different story. So you know the best stories like start off a certain way and then like take a complete left turn.
Yeah.
That was kind of the scenario there.
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know what happened, would you regale us?
Oh boy, gotta revisit my trauma. All right, so I was on home turf, Apex Denver. Was pretty hyped up, kind of a competitive guy. Was ready to throw down in the speed competition, and the first round went pretty well. And I think I was in second place behind my boy Seth, who is the real.
We gotta have him on here too.
Please do, because if you stuck with it, he's gonna be like ridiculous.
Yeah, insane.
So my brain's thinking, okay, how am I gonna beat this kid? He's absolutely ridiculous at what we're doing. And they put this ascension into the course, which is like you have to climb up this thing, and there's no like real intuitive way of doing it. And so my brain says, like, I watch Seth and I watch like some of the other guys go up there, and they just scale this wall as though they were like running vertically but horizontally. You know what I mean? Like they went up this thing so quickly that in my brain it says I have to do something crazy to make this work. And so my solution to that, like it is with many things, is to just cannonball myself at a thing with enough velocity that I somehow get through it. And what that turned into was a very fast, very impactful, just like a 1 foot off the wall, straight up to grab a rung. And it was probably one of the highest that's in the gym, which means you have to go at it 100%. And I was practicing it beforehand, hit it about 4 or 5 times, and it was like 50-50. Like one time I'd do the wall run, I'd get the rung. The next time I'd miss it. And my brain's thinking, I just need to drill this down. If I do it twice in a row, then I'm calling it. But I couldn't get it twice in a row. And so one time I came at it with too much speed. I think I leaned back a little bit, so I put my hip in a weird position. And then when I hit the wall, not even coming back down, but just hitting the wall with enough impact on the wall run that I broke my hip, which is the best way to put it. And I kind of collapsed on the ground. And, some injuries, it didn't really hurt. Some injuries, you don't really know where you're at. You kind of get up and walk it off. But this was one where I kind of stood up and tried to jog it off and took a step and put my weight on my right leg and collapsed again. And that's when you're kind of like, okay, this is a little different.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Yeah. So I ended up still kind of running the event. I think in my brain I was thinking, I don't know if I've had an injury like this. It could be a while before I get to do something like this. So I ran the whole thing on just my left leg to finish out, and then I just like went outside and just like bawled. From like, it was a short ball, but it was like I got to get this out because it was just so much energy at that moment. And went back in and had a fun time, but went up to the hospital 2 days later when it wasn't getting any better. Did some x-rays, found out that I had blown out my hip. Hips don't lie, Shakira says. So that was that. Have had surgery. I had surgery a week after kind of getting x-rays, and have been on kind of the road to recovery. But I think my kind of competitive high level parkour days are a little bit over. You never know what you'll do for fun. But that's kind of where we're at right now. So canceled, plans changed, and found a different route, found a different path.
Well, yeah, it was. I mean, I remember seeing first of all, the left, that was the climax when you ran it on your just left leg a little bit, even though, like, I'm sure it was a hard moment for you, but it was like one of the coolest things I'd seen, actually. Just the fact that you were like willing to get up and get back on it, even though, just like as a, I don't know, even if it's just like a fuck you to like the injury, just like, all right, well, I'm still finishing this competition because I'm here to, that was like what I was going to do, is compete.
Right.
And so I commend you for that, because, it's not what everyone maybe should or would do, but it was just like, you could tell like it meant something to you. So that was inspiring.
Well, and there was part of me that wanted to see if I could run it legitimately, right?
Cause with one leg.
Well, with both legs, because
yeah.
you think, you get this mentality, especially having been a relatively high level athlete at one point, they just kind of like play through the pain, excuse me.
Yeah. Or
you just kind of push it. And I didn't really know what the nature of the incident was, but every time that I was collapsing, it was because the head of my leg was literally coming out of the socket of the joint. Like it was just dislocating over and over again. So recognizing that it was actually kind of not possible for me to, I was thinking, well, what do I do now? Like, do you just kind of quit and say, I'm done? But I spent the next month not being able to move, like on crutches. And so I'm glad that I did that, because I kind of knew that I wouldn't be able to after that.
You have a little bit of adrenaline still going.
Yeah, the adrenaline's still going. You got to take advantage of it.
It's loose enough that I can still move around.
Right.
It's like, about to tighten up quick.
Yeah. And I'm not going to make it worse since I'm broken hip. Right. So.
Damn.
It's those.
How did that change the trajectory? Like, obviously, it changed it, like you said.
Yeah. Well, I had a lot of plans for the summer in terms of, traveling for competitions. And in my mind, I had already had the idea that, this might be the last time that I go all in for the circuit for competing in anything, really. Because once, the summer wrapped up, then my residency would start, and I would start going towards the path of licensure for psychology. And it was a scenario where I would probably not be able to train at that level consistently enough to compete again. So I had a whole summer kind of planned out around going all in on parkour, because it was probably going to be the last time that I could do it. And suddenly I had a lot of free time. And suddenly I was spending 12 weeks on crutches. And it was the thing where, a choose your own adventure moment. It was one of those. It's like I had a plan and now I don't. So what am I going to do with all this time, and what am I going to do with being functionally disabled for X amount of time? So I'm thankful and lucky in some ways that I did have kind of psychology, and I did have a different passion that I could pour my time and energy into and kind of get started and get a head start on a lot of the projects that I was willingly putting on the back shelf so that I can compete in parkour. And then, just shifting mindset a little bit, because if I didn't have that, then I think it probably would have been really depressing.
Yeah, no doubt. Good idea to have some backup passions or like multiple passions.
Right.
Yeah.
Things
so
you can put
that
your
if
energy into.
one of these tent poles gets knocked out, your whole circus doesn't come crashing down.
Absolutely. That's a good way of putting it.
But, well, that's great, man. And let's talk about some of those maybe. Like, obviously, I've just been catching up, just like, the least effort way with just reading Instagram. But,
Sure, yeah.
But, you said you wrote a book and you've been doing some other cool things. Like, I'm very curious what the book's about.
Yeah.
And where you're going with that.
For sure. So the book is kind of one in a series of steps, because you can't just come up with a cool thing. You have to like write a book about it and have blog posts and have an Instagram, and you have to do all these things to promote it.
Yeah.
So the first book was I actually started writing when I was as a way of procrastinating writing my dissertation. Because in my brain, I went, if I have to write this dissertation and do this thing, which I really don't want to do, then I should be willing to put equal time into doing something that I really do want to do. So the first book right now kind of tentatively titled is like the fitness journey. And that was kind of a hashtag at the time. So I figured it was trendy, but it kind of looks at defining fitness a little bit differently and then kind of defining what the components or pillars of fitness are. And so there's a lot of books and frameworks which dive into those different components, but I kind of go about defining it a little bit differently, which makes it a little bit more realistic, a little bit less fitness industry based and a little bit more based in what I feel like is a sustainable lifestyle.
And can you describe like what's missing maybe from the fitness industry, or how did you change it? Like,
sure.
In a way.
So for this book and the way I set it up is kind of going back to what the definition of fitness is in the first place. Because people think, you talk about fitness, they think about sports, they think about working out, they think about doing all these active things, right? And that's the first thing that comes to mind because that's how it's branded. But, the original idea of fitness was actually coined around the Darwinian era when they're talking about survival of the fittest, right? And I think the thing that people miss nowadays is that what makes a human being most fit is not that we're the strongest animal or that we're the fastest animal or that we could fly or breathe in the water. Like we are like pathetic compared to the top 10 of all those categories in the actual animal kingdom. What made us most fit was that we had a 3-pound supercomputer in our brain, was that that was our brain, right? Was that we were able to form these really complex social networks and had strength in numbers and could form tribe and could work as a unit at a very high level. That's something that no other animal could do. So I take it a step back and say, what are all the things that actually make us fit, and use those to define fitness, as opposed to who can do the most number of flips or who can swim across the English Channel. Like all these things that they say, whoa, that's fitness. And it's like, well, maybe, but not really. That's not what's giving us the advantage. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's what are some of these other things? Like you said, social, like cooperation,
right,
is one of them. It sounds like.
Yeah. So the 5 pillars that I talk about in the book, and each one of its own chapter, is physical health. Okay. Because health is really important. You got a body. It's kind of the vehicle that you use to pilot through life. If your vehicle's engine light is on, then you're not living as high quality life as you could, right?
Yeah.
The next one is mental fitness, right? Is how to use your mind, which is your biggest advantage, to gain that advantage. Because just because you have it doesn't mean that you're actually using it optimally. So we look at mental fitness as a component of that. Social connection is a huge one. That we were a social species built out of tribe, and that's just baked into our DNA. And so if you're not leveraging your ability to form connections, if you're not forming tribe and a community towards a shared purpose or goal, that's some place where you could be missing out. And the last 2 are meaningful work. Human beings have, they've always had to work. Our ancestors had to hunt and gather, right? And they had to do all these sorts of things. But the idea of a job is kind of recent. It's kind of new. It's kind of post-industrial age, right? So we've always had work, and we've always had ways of finding meaning in our work. Doesn't mean we've always had employment or a job or some sort of subservience to a system, right? That's a little bit new. We're still navigating that. And then the last one is what I call spiritual fortitude, is the fact that human beings can think so abstractly that we can imagine things like our own death. And we can flirt with all of these unknown ideas, places where we can't rationally go. And because we can't rationalize them, we have to have other ways of coping with them. So our relationship with the unknown is also an important part of our ability to thrive. So those are the kind of the 5 pillars: is the physical health, mental fitness, social connection, meaningful work, spiritual fortitude, that I kind of bring in and continue to define them by this kind of new age or reorigin of fitness itself. And that's the first book, and I'm currently working on the second, because you go to the agents, because there's always these middlemen. between writing a book and publishing it. You go to the agents and you'd be like, well, I wrote this book. And they say, who are you? And you're like,
fair question.
Yeah. And like, do you have like 10,000 Instagram followers? And I'm like, no. And they say, well, I'm almost a doctor. And they're like, come back when you're a doctor. And I'm like, okay. So working on those projects with the idea that there'll be some of the things that I can springboard once I've passed just a few more hurdles. So
that's awesome, man. That book sounds fascinating too. Do you mind if we dive into some of those pillars at all? Or I don't want to reveal too much.
Oh,
for
for
sure.
sure
That like you couldn't. It's a whole book. Like the knowledge is in there.
Right.
And it's not going to come out exactly through a podcast. But
absolutely.
Like physical health, obviously keeping your body physically fit and like joints and stuff strong is, I mean, a lot of people are pretty into that probably listen to this because they're parkour athletes or whatever.
Right.
That's how they found us. Is there anything like, I mean, I want to get into the other ones, like what I'm kind of leaning towards, but
yeah,
with physical health, is there anything that is just you found that is huge innovation?
Well, physical health is probably one area that people think about when it comes to fitness. It's a slice of the pie that we can't leave out of the definition of fitness, right? It's there for a reason. I think one of the things that's most interesting is that, working out and the physical aspect of it and nutrition are all things that are included, but there's still a lot that we don't know, especially like in the field of dietetics. Feels like nutrition advice changes every 5 years.
It's fucking infuriating. It's like,
right?
I've literally heard everything exact opposite, like from people I respect. I've heard like, don't eat this and only eat the exact thing that they said not to. It's like, it's super hard to figure out what it is, and it makes you kind of want to throw up your hands and be like, whatever.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I think there is at least a trend towards certain things. Like we want to see more whole foods and stuff, and we understand that vegetables are generally good, although some people are like on this all meat diet.
Right.
The carnivore
diet. And then there's like kind of a ketogenic diet, which is like a hyper low carb diet. But yeah, I think there's a lot of that low hanging fruit, like eat less processed crap, like probably should have less sugar in your diet, things that we're leaning into a little bit more. But outside of that, it's very difficult to come to a consensus. And knowing that what the recommendations are now are going to change in 5 years. And it's going to be a while until we really narrow that down. So I think those are some of the areas that we dive into a little bit more, because even then, step one is knowing what you're supposed to eat. Like, what if you think you're eating healthy and you don't even know? And step two,
just awareness.
It's crazy. But the second step is actually doing it. So there's all the things that we know that you should do that people kind of don't get around to.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like why I start talking about the intention behavior gap, is that everyone walks right up to the edge of intention. But there's this psychological landscape in between wanting to do something so bad and actually taking action towards it. So those are some of the things that we kind of start to add to that discussion, I feel.
Yeah.
But to try to get into more depth. But yeah, that's fitness 101.
That's fitness. Yeah, the diet stuff is fascinating. I'm like learning a lot about the gut biome is another big like popular, and for good reason. It's like it's a fascinating territory that was becoming more and more. We're mining a lot more information out of that, and just understanding like what this relationship with the microorganisms that live within us actually does to our mental health too, which it really affects, and there's 100%. Other things, and then it even ties in with this weird spiritual shit, because like at least it does for me, because you start to understand like you have like you are like an earth.
Yeah,
like
there's
you're
a tiny world inside of you.
There's a world in here, and you're choosing like things to feed these communities inside you.
Yeah, and the communities are sending up little serotonin prayers to ask you what foods to eat.
Yeah, it's true.
And you kind of respond to that.
Yeah, it's true, man.
And it's wild. And they, some other emerging fields are like nutrigenomics, like what you eat changes your gene expression.
Oh my God.
Right. So there's epigenetics, which talks about like how your environment impacts how your genes express themselves. Well, they're finding out that what you eat, different eating patterns based off of your previous genetics, but also it's like an internal environment that changes gene expression as well. So there are crazy rabbit holes that are just now being dug into, and that when it comes to the depth of that information, it is really diluted when it comes to the recommendations of what people eat. And some of those recommendations are decades out of date.
Yeah. Yeah. My God. Because by the time it gets to print sometimes, or that's by the time, because they're waiting for people to become a doctor.
Oh, yeah.
You know, there's this balance always between jumping through the right hoops and being in front of it and just being like, all right, I'm not going to go through the system. I'm just going to go circumvent the system, which you're going to see more and more of. Like, I think these middlemen are disappearing. Mm-hmm. That's what the internet is trying to be about.
Yeah. Well, and then there's a lot of the .gov kind of organizations, which, what do they base their information, their recommendations off of? Well, they're not basing it off of what's happening right now, what's developing right now. There's a lot of pushback. So by the time it gets to the point where, legislators are deciding, what the regulations are, it's already passed through so many middlemen that it's like a game of telephone. You don't even know what they're going to come up with. So
and some of these middlemen have a vested interest in, obviously, Well, hold on a second. Grains aren't good. I'm a grain company. I make shitload of grains, and if I don't get to make them, then there's going to be billions of dollars, trillions. I'm not super versed on it, and I don't want to have that conversation.
No, you're 100% right.
Yeah.
Like, there's no reason that we have dairy products. Like, some dairy products are great, but if we took dairy out of people's lives, it's not like everyone's going to be suddenly calcium deficient. Like, that's not the case.
Yeah.
Right? So big dairy, big farming, they have a vested interest in making sure that we have a glass of milk with every meal. Well, how many people are actually going to do that? Yeah. Oh, and also more than half the people of the planet are at least a little bit lactose intolerant. So if everyone has a little bit of intolerance to this thing that you're pushing because an entire industry depends on it, it's questionable.
It's very questionable.
It's worth questioning.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying.
It's like, just the very fact that, like, milk was advertised.
Yeah.
As milk.
That's your
it wasn't like a brand name. It wasn't Robinson's Dairy. It wasn't.
Yeah. That's a great point.
Organic farm. It's like, that should have raised suspicions out of the gate. It's just like, why do they want us to drink milk?
I didn't think about that.
Why is milk such a good? Why do they all get together to push milk at us?
Wow, that's a good point. Like, I've never seen an advertisement like onions.
Yeah,
you should eat some
more onions. Go out and have that.
Oh, that's
it's
funny.
Very strange.
That is very strange. It makes it worth questioning. But ice cream is delicious, so you know what? For as long as it's not poisonous for you, do what you got to do. But all I'm saying is that the recommendations have been filtered down to the point where they don't completely reflect the science, the dietetic fields.
Well, that's sorry.
I was just going to say that's kind of the level of depth that we try to go to with the kind of that physical health chapter, and then some of the stuff we talk about later. But yeah, that was like kind of the first pillar. I don't know.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good pillar. On to the next one.
Right.
If we can, the mental health. Like, obviously, as a psychologist, counseling psychologist, and soon to be PhD, I'm sure you have a lot to say about it.
Quite.
Where do we begin?
That's kind of my bread and butter. But so there's this weird, and it gets into this like philosophical level of like, how much free will do we have? Can I even use my mind to make decisions? Is everything determined? Like, I start off by saying, who really knows what's pulling the strings? Is it your environment? Is it your subconscious? Is it all of these abstract archetypes? You never know. But all I'm saying is that what if using your brain to direct your focus changes your trajectory by 1%? And not just 1% now, but it's a 1% that kind of compounds over time. So that it's 1% today, and it's 1% tomorrow, and it's 1% the next day, and so on and so forth. So that over the course of a year of just steering your attention and steering your focus towards a certain direction, you've gotten way closer than you've just been wandering randomly. Right? And so it doesn't matter if we have 100% free will. We just have to make sure that everything's not 100% determined. Even if by our conscious brain we can only influence 1% of the equation, it's still worth doing over time. And so I go less into the mental health fold and kind of go into the mental fitness aspect, because that's something that is applicable to everyone, I'd hope. But it's just looking at what are the ways that we can find and harness that 1% advantage every day, and in any direction. And I think that's really important. It's not like a new concept, but
but I love it, and I find that to be true too. Is like you're probably only getting that 1%. Like that might be generous, but even if it was 0.1% over time, that's going to be a hockey stick curve that goes like steers you into a much better place.
Ideally, something that becomes exponential.
Yeah.
So I think that is kind of without going into too much depth into any one area of like what mental fitness could look like, because you're right, I have a lot of opinions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I do want to go into some depth.
Right.
Let's like how would you start getting mentally fit, or how do you start to harness your 1%?
So there's a lot of different ways that folks can cultivate their 1%. And I might actually talk about this less in like the mental fitness chapter of that book, but actually a little bit more in like the Mind the Gap book, which is the second one that I'm writing.
The gap that you were talking about
right,
earlier.
That intention behavior gap. Yeah.
I'm already hype on these two books.
I'm happy about them too. I hope everyone likes them
yeah.
When I write them, and I hope they get published because I don't control that. But so when you look at anyone and they want to make a decision, there's this lot of pressure around willpower. Like, no, you just need to be more disciplined. Just have willpower. Just like, you want to not smoke, just stop smoking. Cold turkey right now. Yeah. And you see that in a lot of, personal development, self-help gurus, right? Just make the decision. Just make the decision.
Do it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean that's Nike's slogan, right?
Yeah.
And it's not as easy as just developing or having some kind of willpower. But there's another skill that you do have, which is really important, and that's your ability to focus your attention. Now, I am admittedly one of the countless people who has tried and failed to meditate over and over and over again. And yeah.
Put your hands up out there.
Because I'm busy and I have other things to do, and no one's good at it. So only a select few advanced human beings can really meditate consistently. But it's the idea that I'm pointing my attention at one thing, and then when my mind wanders, I'm just going to bring it back to that thing. And for meditation, that's your breathing or a mantra or the idea of nothingness. They point it at something that's kind of mundane, and then just practice for 10, 15, 30 minutes, bringing their attention back to that thing. And attention is so important because if we point ourselves at a goal and then our mind wanders over here and we don't know how to bring our mind back to that goal, then our attention becomes contingent. It becomes based off of the deterministic factors of our environment. So I think that's where people could get that 1%. And that's baked into some activities in life. That's baked into sports, right? You have to be able to focus on what you're doing. That's baked into parkour, 100%. I can't be walking on a rail in a non-mindful state because I'm going to fall off that rail.
At least cross yourself eventually.
Eventually, you got to cross yourself. And if you're at height, I hope your bails are good, right? In some ways, that happens in school, right? Because you're forced to sit an hour for things that sometimes you couldn't give a blank about, right? But you find yourself in these situations where you can cultivate attention, but for a lot of folks, that's not the case. And so one way that you could potentially hone that 1% is the intentional practice of training your attention so that when your mind wanders off, and it will, you're able to gently guide it back. And that doesn't necessarily have to be through meditation, but find something that you can do mindfully enough, that you enjoy enough that you're willing to do it, and practice that thing.
100%. And practice multiple of those things. Going back to the first part of our conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. If you have zero things, because a lot of people are starting with zero. Yeah. They're just chickens with their head comes off, running around, not really knowing. Like they'll dabble in this, dabble in that, but not really make progress in anything. Then I'd say start with one thing. And then once you get some efficacy, some mastery efficacy in that one thing, but then you say, oh, I can learn one thing. I can keep my mind on one thing. Maybe I can keep my mind on another thing. And then you go to that second thing, right? And then that snowballs too.
Yeah.
So once you kind of gain that skill, it's something that translates very well. The habit of attention is very important.
Couldn't agree more. Do you think that there's any... I think it's a little bit fascinating that Nike has that message of just do it. That's all about willpower.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe there's like... Because so many people are at that stage where they're just thinking like, oh, it's willpower. I'll just fucking...
Yeah.
And even though it's maybe not the best tool, or it's not the only tool that they should have, that's one of the reasons why that brand is message capitalizes on that message so well.
Right.
Do you think there's another, and then this is kind of a tangent, but do you
Sure.
think there's any companies out there that kind of represent this level of, or this tool, or bringing that attention into it, you know, because I think it's fascinating, like what some of these companies represent.
Yeah.
Ultimately.
It's hard as a company because you kind of benefit when people make impulsive,
that's that
unattentive, mindless decisions around things, right? You kind of benefit from building that mindless brand loyalty to a thing and have people not really consider it too much. Mm-hmm. I mean, you also benefit from people having mindful decisions about the kinds of things that they consume. But it's really difficult as a company to build your brand around.
It's a very long-term strategy.
It is a very long-term strategy.
Probably not profitable.
Yeah.
Because because like you said, it's most companies are based on like, let's get you to buy something that you probably don't need.
Mm-hmm. So I can probably
almost certainly don't need, but like maybe probably don't even want if you really thought about it.
Yeah, you probably don't need, probably don't want. But in this moment, I just want to do it. I just want to buy this thing right now, right? So there's that double-edged sword to the message. I can probably easier think of people with companies than I can the companies themselves.
And
so I can think of like Aubrey Marcus.
I was gonna say like podcasters, and not to jerk myself off or anything, but like I think that is like one of the things that Aubrey Marcus is someone we both follow.
If you're not going to jerk yourself off, who's going to do it?
I mean, that's true. This is jerking myself. Sometimes.
Good.
It's a little too masturbatory sometimes though. When I do the solo blast,
gotta accept it.
It's literally called solo blast. When I do a solo,
oh, it is.
Why did I call it that? God damn it. Anyhow, but sorry, continue. But Aubrey Marcus does have a message that is. Okay, let's get more intentional. Let's get more of our attention under control. Let's become better. I mean, his company's total human optimization.
Absolutely. But then I wouldn't think of onit.com necessarily as that thing that symbolizes it. It's like a supplement company. They're good supplements, but they're still trying to get me to buy a thing for 10% off. Yeah. So that's hard. That's difficult. That's a different level of like ethical corporate responsibility that we'll see if capitalism ever gets there.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, it could be it's forced upon them eventually. You know, this is the trend. We don't know what the future will hold, but
absolutely,
it's definitely changing the game. Like to have this kind of access and reach, everyone's kind of like a mini celebrity if they want to be now, and therefore there's like a lot of it's still very noisy, but there's going to be a shift, I think, in just like how things fundamentally operate when you don't need to have someone sell your products in the same way.
Well, it's hard to forecast, and there's some futurists that will imagine what the outcome will be. And then I try to bring it back to, I don't know if I can influence the future to that dynamic and extent, but who knows? I might have that 1% today.
1%. That's a good place that's always a better place to start than way too far ahead.
Right.
That'll overwhelm you. It certainly overwhelmed me at times.
100%. Or 1%.
1%. Yeah, I say 100%. Like that's one of my favorite sayings.
Yeah,
switching it.
We're switching it up.
We switch it up. 1%.
People are going to be confused.
They're going to be like, "What do you mean 1%?"
We're about to
be like, "Listen to the 1% episode."
You're about to get about the woke wealthy, on this 1%.
It's about that. It's about that amount of attention that you probably have control over. That if you master, becomes a huge piece of your life,
of who you could become.
You could be.
Self-actualization.
Well, and that's like, to get meta on it real quick, you're like, what is that? What this trend of people really getting into self-actualization and human optimization is kind of a new idea in and of itself. And maybe it is more trendy than it is the future, like we think, but it's just like any of these futurist ideas. It's like, I think we kind of have a belief that, when we turn on all these epigenetics and we express more genes as humans, like we're interested in what humans are really capable of beyond, just what we're doing now.
Yeah. I have opinions on that too. Do you want to add? I don't know which rabbit holes that are worth going down.
Well, let's just pick one.
Okay.
What's a rabbit hole?
Well, the rabbit hole that I could have an opinion on is kind of that humanistic idea, which kind of harkens to Maslow's hierarchy of needs and Carl Rogers, some of like the OG humanists, which is that, to use an analogy, humans are kind of like a seed, and that seed will stay dormant as a seed until it has the necessary components to grow. And when those components are met, when those preconditions are met, and has water and sunlight and some soil with some nutrients, it can't help but to grow. The seed doesn't make a conscious decision to like, I'm going to sprout now. Like, no, sometimes the seed finds itself in the crack of a sidewalk in the middle of a city, and it just happens to have enough of what it needs to sprout up right there. Yeah. Right. So it doesn't decide what environment is, but if those prerequisites are met, it's going to grow. And they kind of take some of those same ideas to the human experience, that, humans have an innate desire for development and for growth. There's this thing pushing us forward. Yeah. It doesn't matter what it's pushing us forward towards, or the environment that we're in when it's pushed. Sometimes we're in terrible environments. We end up pushing terrible things like drugs. I thought pushing drugs, there was a pun there. Yeah. But the idea is that if you gave someone love and compassion and a social environment that is rewarding, and you gave them the food and shelter, their base needs on that hierarchy of needs, that our natural propensity is to grow towards some actualized self. Yeah. So we're not just a reflection of an ideology or something that's stuck in survival mode, but we get to express our individual essence on the planet, I guess. And so that's kind of the humanistic idea, that there is something in everyone that is waiting for the right conditions to sprout up. I just hope that you sprout up in like a nice, cozy field and not like a sidewalk. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, I like that analogy. I mean, I definitely like I think life is, in plant life and human life, there's a lot of fun parallels to draw there, because
that's just an analogy that kind of makes sense.
Because yeah, totally.
Because some people end up getting planted in like an indoor space, watered by someone else. Hopefully, like they're put on a windowsill so they get some sunlight, and then when their roots spread, they figure out they're in a pot, and they can't get their roots that deep, right?
Yeah, and then
so there's a lot of analogies that I could pull, but so that's kind of the humanistic perspective. And now you see that there's a lot of fitness-based, corporations and human optimization that's trying to promote those sorts of things. Yeah. And I think it's just kind of a reflection of like a human reality, that we have the opportunity to pursue those ventures in higher quantities than at any point in human history.
Totally. Yeah. No, I love that analogy, because the conditions are really important. Like they're more important. Like, yeah, you might be in the pot, or you might be in the crack in the sidewalk, right. And there's a pretty big limit there, unless something, and yeah, we're more complex than a seed.
Absolutely.
Potentially. So we might be able to uproot and plant ourselves somewhere else.
Yeah, glad you said that.
And that's a good thing. But it still makes it difficult if you have to do that, if you're born in the rainforest or whatever. But like if you're planted in the rainforest, you might just have a lot of nutrients, and then you can grow as tall as you need to from ground zero.
100%. Or 1%.
1%.
1%. And the thing is that human beings are also way more adaptable than plants. Yeah. So sometimes I feel like folks are adaptable to a fault, that we find ourselves in toxic environments or toxic relationships that we adapt to. And we're so flexible with our ability to adapt to different environments, that we end ourselves planted in environments that aren't meant for us, but are kind of stuck there because we're not willing to move. So there's some resistance there too, and talk about resistance and resilience as being two sides of the same coin. But mental fitness,
babies. It's important. I'm fascinated with that kind of stuff personally. I think that, I've discovered limiting beliefs in myself that I'm like, it's a lot of work to try to change them, but I just am curious to see what the results will be.
Right.
You're like, oh, if I can actually steer that 1%. Because like for me, sometimes that's what the 1% with mental fitness is about, is just like catching those thoughts, like my, and just examining them and being like, that's not, no, and bringing it back to, okay, this is where I'm going again, like you're saying. But I agree. We've programmed ourselves for, I spent 27 years or whatever doing a different style of thinking.
Have we programmed ourselves, or has someone else or something else programmed us?
Ooh.
Is it Big Brother?
Big Brother.
They watching?
Well, it was the 1%, maybe it was the 1% that we carried with us. It's a windy 1%.
Yeah. So social connection, meaningful work, spiritual fortitude. Which one is most?
Let's see here.
Which calls to you?
Let's hit the
social
connection.
It's a tough choice. It's a tough choice to make.
Yeah.
Social connection is easy because I feel like it's already a part of everyone's lives, and we kind of recognize that family or tribe or these things are really important. And then I also think that there's aspects that we could all get better on, because there's a skill, there's a finesse, there are more sophisticated ways of communication and those sorts of things. Which I feel as though we almost have to learn given our circumstances, given the fact that we have been sectioned off and like put into our own rooms in our own territories, and aren't giving the opportunity to find tribe easily. They talk about Dunbar's number, which is like the estimated amount of humans which we were like that our brain can kind of handle. Yeah. Which, if we took a whole normal curve, is probably about like 50 to 250 people. And then we take those same brains and we dump them into a city with 100,000 people, and then just kind of see what happens when you'll pass way more than Dunbar's numbers worth of people just on the way to work. And so the human brain wasn't really cooked in a place where we were used to seeing strangers literally every day. And so that's kind of a new event for us as well, is having to cope with the fact that I am surrounded by other humans. Because if you were a tribesman 10,000 years ago, you knew everyone in your tribe, you knew everyone in your band. And if you saw a human that wasn't strange, or that was a stranger, like that was someone else from a different tribe somewhere, like you would be really suspicious of that person, wouldn't you? Right?
You'd be very curious. You need to know.
Yeah, you need to know. It's like if aliens like popped up tomorrow, we wouldn't be like, "Oh, what's up, aliens?" No, we'd be like, "What's up with these aliens?" Right? And that's kind of the same kind of. It's baked into the human nature that like that person is not from my tribe. Right, that's in the brain. So we have a really interesting experiment going on where we took the human brain and the human nature and plucked it out of nature and put it into this artificial thing. Yeah, and then said like, "Good luck." So, and it's not like it's going to go backwards. There's no situation where we're going to like section off into tribes and spread out again. Yeah. That's not going to happen. No. So now we have to kind of learn a bunch of new skills and a bunch of new techniques to cope. Right. And we have to figure out how to relate to one another in a scenario which our nature isn't 100% equipped for. And so that's kind of where the rabbit hole that the social connection route goes down, is if relationships are hard, it's because we're in a social environment which is completely removed from the way that our social brain was wired. And now we're compensating for it. Mm.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The way that social media has played into it too. It's like the way that we're trying to find tribe, like even through a medium like podcasting or something like this, it's like it's great to have an audience, but the connection is not the same kind of connection you would have with your tribe.
Right.
Whatever 10,000 years ago, that's face to face. This is through a digital media, and it makes me wonder, like, as that Darwinian perspective, are we now selecting for people that are just adapting to? I mean, without question, we are selecting for people that are adapting to the technology.
100%.
And what's that doing? Because it's 1%. It's that 1%.
Yeah.
And but there still exists a bunch of people that don't have the same. There still exists many people that have very, very different lifestyles than what we're doing here in America or in Colorado or Denver.
Right. And then as I lament some of those things, number one, all the research that they've done based off of this massive observational study, which is social media, they're kind of inconclusive. Sometimes they say it's bad. Sometimes they say it's good. So science hasn't given us a whole lot of great clues about whether that's good or bad for us. But even lamenting that, it's not going to somehow go backwards.
No.
This is a forward thing. We're on this train. So.
Oh yeah. There's no turning around.
Yeah. So you kind of have to say, given that this is probably my reality, what's kind of the best way to cope? How do I still try? How do I still connect? Maybe that is with social media.
Yeah.
Right?
If you get, and that's awesome if that's your thing.
Yeah.
Or if it isn't, either way.
Right. And it's a tool, and like all the other tools we've had in the past, like you got to figure out a good way to use it. But that one, even as someone who wants to be a psychologist, still something I'm wrapping my head around. Still something that I don't really have a good answer for. So just learn the skills, like do what you have to do, know that it's important, and cope the best you can, because times they are changing.
Oh, they're changing so fast. Yeah, the communication, can you touch on that a little bit more with like what kind of communication styles you think are necessary now that we're moving towards this direction and in this unstoppable, unreversing steam engine?
Man, for some reason my brain went straight to the differences between cultures and the differences between languages even. So I've been working at the Refugee Wellness Center, where I have the privilege of being one of the first people that people see, one of the first Americans that folks that are refugees, asylees, parolees from different countries come to America. I do one of their mental health screenings, and I use a translator who's in the room with me, who speaks both English and the native language of this other person. First of all, I've learned so many different languages that I didn't know existed. I've actually discovered countries that I didn't know were countries. And that's a very humbling experience when you're like, where's Eritrea? Like, where's this place? And
like, what?
It's like, it's on the Horn of Africa, bro. Like, where's your geography? But in those moments, there is this kind of elegant dance that goes on, because I get to watch the person say something, and they have expression and they have movement and there's a body language. But then there's a lag in between the translator hearing it, turning to me and saying that same thing in English. And they're not saying it word for word, because some words don't exist the exact same way, but they're trying to, but they are trying to pass it through this filter and then hand it to me in a way that I understand so that I can do the same thing. So have you ever seen a video where the audio and the video were kind of off?
Yeah.
Where you like saw them do a thing and then like you heard it and it just felt weird? Like it kind of feels like that, but in the room, in a therapeutic scenario where I'm supposed to be talking to this person about their mental health and screening for those things. And so you're super intentional about every word that you say, because there's a lot of psychological jargon that I could use that is difficult to translate. There are a lot of like turns of phrases that I could use that don't quite make sense in someone else's culture. That makes sense for me because I take them for granted, but don't exactly have the same meaning for someone else. And So you really have to slow down and process and say, what is the most effective way that I can put the words that I have together, knowing that they're going to be translated to speak to this other person effectively, so that we can somehow bridge the gap between us, a cultural gap, a language gap. And I think we take for granted the fact that even in the United States, there's differences in those cultures. There's differences in cultures in the United States, depending on where you're born in the world and all these political backgrounds and all these religious backgrounds. It's a diverse place. And we take for granted because we're all speaking English. I might have actually touched on this in the last podcast almost a little bit, but it's the idea that there are more effective ways of communicating, and those are sometimes thrown aside so that we can just spit out what we want to say as quickly as we can say it. I think a lot of turmoil between relationships, between groups of people, between different ideologies could be entirely avoided if we could find a way to bridge that gap. So I give some examples of things that we kind of use that is kind of effective in psychology, but that is a high level of sophistication. There's a very elegant thing happening, and kind of recognizing that any transaction between two people is a transaction of energy that goes beyond the language, beyond the culture, might give us an opportunity to just slow down enough to think of, what is the most effective way that I could have them understand exactly what I'm trying to say. That was a rant. I'm sorry.
No, I
went off.
That was not a rant. That was powerful stuff.
Words.
I think that's exactly spot on, honestly. It's been something I've been trying to introduce more into my life, is careful selection of words, and careful intention with what am I trying to say? Why am I trying to say it? Because I think that there's maybe a place for it still to just like have fun and shoot the shit and whatever.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's something we're wanting to give up as like humans.
Right. There's still a place for small talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in humor, I would say maybe even like there's something about being able to just say whatever you want. The freedom to be able to that's the cost of being really serious and intentional. I think with your words is if you're gonna think carefully about what you say, you're not gonna be able to like improv a joke,
right?
Or it's a different tool. It's a different side of communication. And that could probably be reserved for somebody who really knows you well. Or like, but when you're trying to bridge a gap,
right? I
totally agree that it's the slower you go, the better and more smooth the communication will be.
Right.
And I've read that, and I've told people about this, and I'm sure you've probably read the Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication.
Yeah.
And that's like, as far as I can tell, the starter kit to like start
the starter kit,
to exploring like how to do some of these things better.
Right. Yeah.
If you have an important conversation.
Absolutely.
If you're trying to accomplish something important.
No, I'm right there with you, and there's that level of familiarity which you like have inside jokes and those sorts of things. But then there's also a certain level of intimacy or closeness that you have with a person where you begin to take things for granted again. When you like live with someone or you're in a relationship where you just kind of assume that they should kind of know what you're saying and how you're saying it, or know what you want, or you should know me well enough that you intuitively just kind of like experience what I want and should just generate. Right. And so there's this ebb and flow where you don't know someone at all and you're trying to bridge that gap, but you know someone so well that you have to go back to some of those same skills to be able to communicate effectively. So, there's a lot of potential layers to it, but that's kind of the big part of social connection, is recognizing that there is that layer of depth that we kind of need to attend to. That's
definitely the deficit of most people, I would say, including especially me. Like, I'm pretty comfortable when I'm comfortable to like be the whatever kind of style of language and intuiting. But where I'm working more is, and what I would 100% agree is just the depth.
How to be my authentic self but still communicate in a way that the other person understands me. Because I will also agree that if I'm being 100% myself, I'm like loud and opinionated, and like I'm not surprised when I hear through the grapevine that like someone doesn't kind of like me based off of just kind of seeing me around, and I'm like, yeah, I kind of get that. Like I'm loud and sometimes obnoxious, and I get that. But if they sat down with me, I know that we would find some common ground. So that doesn't bother me too much because I'm like, you know what? But they would like me if they knew me. You know? So I don't know. That's a little bit of my own narcissism that has that confidence. That
I mean, narcissism is a tricky word. Is a certain amount that's necessary.
Yeah, I think
to forge your own life.
Yeah. Yeah, you just said a deep thing.
Ooh.
I think you did.
Well,
can you say that again for me, actually?
I said there's a certain amount of narcissism that's required to forge your own life.
Ooh. I actually don't want to explain that one. I just want people to think about it.
Think about it.
Just think about it.
Just think about it. Moving on.
Yeah. In which direction, my friend?
Moving on to the fourth pillar.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Because we might as well just cover them all. We've gotten this far.
Okay.
We'll leave the spiritual one for last because that's probably the unknown.
That's the unknown.
That'll be the most unknown of the five.
It's mysterious. It's building suspense.
And let's get into. Sorry, what are we missing?
Meaningful work.
Oh, of course. This is a really important one.
I feel like it is.
Do you think? Yeah, I could keep.
Go ahead. No, what are you gonna say?
I was gonna say, like, is this something that is this kind of like maybe goes in hand with that narcissism sometimes. With meaningful work, it's like, well, I don't know. Maybe we'll circle back to it, but I'm just when you're trying to find out who you are or what you like, it's sort of a balance to that social connection. Right. Meaningful work to you is, I don't know. I want to get your opinion on it.
Yeah. And I can riff on this one. I mean, we already chatted about how like work is just an intrinsic part of the human experience, that every human ever has had to work in one way or another. And that jobs and those sorts of things are new. So trying to take it back to those roots if we can, of finding work that is meaningful. And a part of that is perhaps that like egoistic expression of self through work. Like, I am really good at XYZ thing, and I can do it in such a way that I can make a living and provide for others and those sorts of things. And then, based off of certain cultures, part of that is also the ability to give back to community. It's less about myself and more about this really like deeply ingrained desire to give back to others. And so I think there's two sides of a coin there in terms of the psychology of work. But the meaningful paradigm of work, and I leave the word meaningful there because you can't just do any work. It has to have some purpose. You have to feel like it's tied into something that is more than just a means to an end. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because a lot of people, you do end up having to do some things that you don't feel are meaningful or that you don't feel are significant, but you got to put food on the table and you got to pay rent at the end of the month. And a lot of us find ourselves in those places. But when you find a vocation that you can pursue that's really meaningful for you, then to a degree, as long as it's meeting your basic needs, you don't care how much you make. And I would always prefer to make more than less, but finding ways of making those things significant. Sometimes the meaningful thing doesn't matter what I'm doing, I'm feeding my family. That's significant. Survival is significant, right? If that's all you have. So I think really looking at the role that work plays in our lives, because I think in a capitalistic society, well, I'm sure you could find ways of any society that work can become kind of toxic or corrupted, but maybe a focus on other things like money has kind of taken away the primacy of meaning and purpose.
I think that's the story I just heard from a TED talk I just watched of some guy who's saying that exact kind of like that. This is our generation, is what we're trying to do. Is we've realized that like the generations that came before us were chasing the money and the prestige and status,
right?
And now that we've kind of mined that and realized that it's not actually good, we're mining this meaning and purpose in terms of how we define success as a generation,
right?
And that's, his theory was, I don't remember his name, sorry, but
that's fine.
That's like when you talk about giving back to community, that is what we're looking for, and that's actually why there's so much struggle for like millennials or whatever, is because there's so few industries set up maybe that are providing that meaningful type of work.
Right.
But I mean, and that to me sounds like, then make an industry. I don't know, but
yeah,
but that's not. It's not that it's an excuse. It's just it might be a reason that it is like more difficult for why people think that's the me generation, and people are actually like super self-absorbed with millennials. His insight was that it's not exactly that we're self-absorbed. It's that we're trying to find meaningful work, and through that complaining or whatever maybe that people perceive is complaining, it's actually a protest to the status quo.
Yeah, it's a rebellion, and I think I would agree with the TED Talk speaker mostly, and agree with you now.
We'll find you, guys.
We'll Google you.
I'll find him and
put him in the show notes.
Put him in that show note.
That, to a degree that this generation is able to reap the benefits of the previous generation, which was able to create the platform for us to move forward, but we're still in a scenario where, if you go through the traditional schooling system in the West, you go through those high school years, and then, if you have a certain amount of resource, then you go to college. And then as your brain starts really turning on, you realize that every step up until this point has been determined for you by a system with good intentions, right? Education's a great thing. And also, you don't have a lot of opportunity to practice autonomy in the world yet. So if you do want to do something meaningful, you either have to kind of enmesh your identity with something to the degree that your contribution to a company or your contribution to an organization is like really meaningful, or a cause, right, is really meaningful to you, or you have to make it yourself. And so I think that's why we're also seeing, the number of entrepreneurs that we're seeing, that is a growing trend. That people are trying to look for what is the path, because path A isn't going to work for me. Path B of kind of just throwing my lot in with some organization or some cause doesn't really fit with me. That's not really authentic. So I'm just going to have to make something myself. And it's not easy to make something yourself. And the system allows for that level of freedom. But you have to do a lot of internal work. You have to focus on yourself. You have to be the one to be your own IT company or your own IT service when you're trying to set up the video and audio for your podcast, right? Because otherwise it costs a lot of money to do that.
Yeah.
And so that looks selfish on the surface.
Yeah. That's kind of what I was pointing to with like the meaningful work and the narcissist like theme in it. It's just like it does require a lot of energy to forge that path, take a trail and split into a new offshoot and fork the road. It's certainly like that internal work and stuff is where you, I think, have to do the most.
Right.
It's actually, I think, a lot easier to make these moves and things when you have done those.
Right. Because then you have kind of the license, the permission to be an individual.
Yeah. And
if you haven't done that work, it's a lot easier to kind of lean on other people's identity or the identity of a group or the identity of a cause. But you have to do a little bit of that internal work to be able to lean on yourself sometimes. Yeah. At least long enough to forge your own path in the world if that's what you want to do. Yeah. So I think that I wish that the meaningful work area was a little bit deeper, but I think it's really just trying to recognize that what we do should have a purpose, a direction that is perhaps bigger than ourselves in some ways.
Definitely.
And that's a big should. I try not to should too often.
Yeah.
But that's a recommendation that I would make for some people. And maybe that should is, again, making sure my kids get into college. I got 2 kids. I got one in me. I'm getting both of them into college. That's bigger than you. Counts.
Yeah.
Right? So it's not talking about the scale or the perspective necessarily. But that if you are doing something to a means to an end, it may be, I'm putting this out there, not a bad idea to start looking at what the options are for doing something that is not merely an outcome, but is a part of a bigger process.
I think that's the only way that a lot of these people become successful.
Right.
Because there's like almost something weird happening where if you make it bigger than yourself, then you can tap into these bigger energies.
Yeah.
Whereas if you only focused on you, then you run out of steam because you're running on that willpower. You're running on sheer, I've certainly come up against it. I felt like I've made some selfish decisions in my life where I've been like, that actually doesn't sustain. So for me personally, I think it's a worthy recommendation. I'd put second behind that. I'd second it.
I'd second it. Now, and I'm being really, I'm not. It's not like I'm going out on a limb with any of these. Yeah. With any of these pillars, like they're obvious. Yeah. Right. We're just we're trying to reframe them and put them into a depth that is easier to relate to, and that like tie into something other than like, yeah, you should just go get ripped and have abs and be the best you can be. Like that's a little bit surface level-y. So I stick with subjects that are intuitive, but try to take them to a level of depth that maybe they can grow some roots in people's thought process.
All right, last pillar.
Okay.
Let's get it. Spiritual fortitude.
Fortitude. So I'm curious actually, what goes through your mind based off of just that name and kind of the mini summary synopsis that I had talked about earlier?
Spiritual fortitude and the mini
It's not a pop quiz. I'm actually curious. What's your word association?
I think it's kind of based on like that fundamental, like when you preface the whole conversation, it's just like, listen, we kind of don't know anything. We're all just riding on like just conjecture.
Yeah.
So because everything is basically based on this unknown principle,
right,
you have to cultivate, or the spiritual fortitude is like the wrestling and grappling with that concept and finding strategies that make you more effective. Yeah. And use that as fuel, or use it as something to empower you. No,
I'm glad that came through, and I might have even spoiled it a little bit with the synopsis, because I would love to hear how that comes through, because the word spiritualism and how spirituality is kind of it has so many different definitions in people's minds. Yeah. In my mind even, that it can sometimes be a little bit vague. So I try to boil it down to finding that relationship with the unknown and having some sort of internal codex to be able to deconstruct the unknown and like make it something that you can work with. Mm-hmm. And for some people, that is a more traditional religion. Something crazy happens, I have to imagine that it's like part of a bigger plan, right? Yeah. Someone knows the plan. It's not me. Mm-hmm. I'm just going to assume that this is cool. People back in the Greek and Greco-Roman ages, like lightning falls out of the sky. My brain doesn't know how to make sense of what I just saw. So it has to be like Zeus. He has these like javelins that he throws. Mm-hmm. And like, that's what I need to get through that. Right. And there's different levels of sophistication in which people can take that. And that can look like, it can look like philosophy. It can look like nihilism. Well, nothing matters. Yeah. This, it's all kind of for chance. Things are determined. There's actually no point to this. How I make sense of this is that it has no sense.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like kind of an existential, like it has no sense. And also, because it has no sense, it is your responsibility to make sense of it. So people have crafted a number of different codexes,
Mm-hmm.
a number of different, it feels like a coding language, right?
Yeah.
It's how I make sense of all of this, because there are far too many things which actually don't really make sense, that are kind of paradoxical about how reality works.
Mm-hmm.
That if we were waiting around until we answered those questions before we actually did anything, we wouldn't get anywhere. And so your brain does this consciously or it does this unconsciously. And I would rather you do it consciously than to do it unconsciously. So the analogy that I use in the book, I think, is imagine that you were on an island and you were born on that island and you've only been on that island. And all the people that you know have been on that island, and everything that you see is just that island, and there's just ocean. You don't know what's out there. Well, for whatever reason, every once in a while, you just kind of like go for a lap in the ocean, and you're leaving the known, and you go out into the unknown, and you always swim back, and you're like, oh, well, maybe if I made a boat,
Mm-hmm.
I could go a little bit further out. I could explore the unknown. I always got to come back to that mainland, right? But some people can build their boats, and the boats are like yachts, and they're intellectually sound and they're rational, but they're also empathetic and compassionate, right? And they could go out onto the ocean for a few days, have a party, come back.
Yeah.
A storm hits them, they're going to be okay. And then there's some people who like kind of throw some like logs together and wraps them with twine, and they paddle out into the unknown, and it's spooky and scary. Because, oh boy, if that piece of twine falls apart, then this whole boat goes and I have to find my way back to the mainland, because if not, I'm going to drown in this unknown.
Yeah.
So in the way I put it is, it doesn't necessarily matter exactly how you build that boat that you're going to use to paddle out into the unknown. You can use whatever materials you want. It's not bound to one ideology, one religion, one train of thought necessarily. But you got to have that thing. And that thing's going to change. Every time you come back to shore, you're going to make some changes, right? But the bigger boat that you have and the more sturdy it is, the further out you're going to be able to go. The more things you're going to be able to discover, the more things you're going to be able to bring back. So that's kind of...
And the more people you can bring with you.
And the more people you can bring with you, 100%.
Which would be, that's always that's possibly a good thing.
Yeah, and that ties back to social connection, all those things.
Mm-hmm.
So
or we could build an Iron Man suit to explore in the unknown. Maybe you have both. I don't know.
Or like this just bomb.
Maybe it's just for you.
Submarine. You can go below the
unknown
depths.
Exploration, but no one's gonna believe you when you come back.
When you come back, you're gonna be like, oh man, I took some shrooms and that was my ship this evening, and let me tell you, there's 5 layers of dimensions, and they're gonna be like, okay, you need to slow down.
I love this analogy though.
But
it's perfect, I'd say.
Well, I'm glad, because it's in a book now.
It's better be.
This is a garbage analogy, and you should rewrite that chapter.
Well, what do you? How do you build your ship? And what do you actually like conceptualize it and think about it, like giving it constant attention when you go out into the unknown? Are you like, all right, I'm going out to the unknown, captain's log, like fucking, and then when you come back, all right, what happened? Let's break it apart, and then let's update the ship.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Philosophically, I'm kind of I would identify with existentialism, in that I recognize that when I do go out to sea, there's going to be some things I'm not prepared for, and there's going to be some things which don't quite make sense, and I'm going to see them, and I don't necessarily have to make sense of them right now. But I try to include enough things on the boat that if I have to face the unknown, that I can kind of improvise.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know if I'm going to need a thing, but I'm going to bring it together. I'm going to bring it along, because I might have to MacGyver myself something when I'm faced with something which really just blows my mind, and I don't have time to get back to shore to make sense out of.
Get that escape hatch.
You got an escape pod or something, or like a little safety like boat on the
another
side.
dinghy.
Yeah. If my boat goes down, like I can at least
we got some backup boats.
I can get in my dinghy with the little motor and like at least get back to dry land, right?
Yeah.
So I think the ship looks a little bit different every time I go out. One time it's a motorboat. Sometimes I might need a kayak. Another time that I jump on a cruise ship, you know. And so I don't get too attached to the boat necessarily.
You're browsing some boats before you make a purchase.
Right. And sometimes I'm like, I've never been on that boat before. Let's see what that boat's like.
Yeah.
And then I'll go out into the unknown in that boat. I might not make it too far, or I could just go deep into that quote unquote rabbit hole, deep into the sea, and I come back. So yeah, it's less one boat and more giving myself an opportunity to explore a plethora of boats, but to bring the things I need with me.
That's an interesting strategy of itself, because maybe the storm that takes you out in an unknown one day.
Yeah.
Because you never know, right? The future's unpredictable, and part of what makes us so powerful as a species is adaptability.
Yeah.
Then let's say the dinghy goes down and you're floating on some driftwood in the unknown, but then you float up on some other abandoned boat.
Yeah.
But now you know how to pilot this boat too, because you've been practicing. You've familiarized yourself with many boats.
Right.
I don't know. I just like this story we're building here.
Yeah. And we're in the middle of
but to bring it
Denver,
back down
Colorado,
to that island and to the earth a little bit, what are some strategies that you would employ for experimenting with different boats? It sounds like, but how is that different philosophies, or is that different practices? Is it
So I intentionally leave this chapter open-ended in terms of the suggestions. I encourage that people do find ways of navigating the unknown, and I encourage that people don't stay on dry land for too long, but I don't go about telling them how to build their boat, because I feel like that's if I told you how to do it, then it wouldn't be yours. It would be some like knockoff version of mine, right? And it's really important that your boat is yours. That it wasn't written down in some book for you to read. There's a lot of books out there. That you just experience the water enough to know what's buoyant and what's not. And at least had the courage to like splash around a bit in the unknown, right? So I don't go as far as giving people tips or tricks.
Well, it's the unknown, right? So
that's hopefully the beauty of it. And then
you don't want to rob them of the ability to build the best boat that we can all look at and jump on one day.
Hopefully,
by steering them into it, whatever, any kind of suggestion. I think that's fair.
Yeah. So, I don't think that's my place, especially as a psychologist, to tell people what boat they should build. But and then the final chapter sums it all up, that all the components are kind of should reflect some sort of authenticity, and I kind of talk about what I feel like that is, and then the book's over. So if you're listening to this, you don't actually have to read it when it comes out. You can just...
No, you do. Yes, you do.
Okay, all
Reading's
right.
important.
Your reading is good.
Or
apparently.
It is for, better retainment, I would say.
If it comes out for audiobook, because I don't really read many books anymore. I mostly...
Yeah, no, I've listened to a lot of stuff. I'm actually... Sometimes I worry that, is the ability to absorb and really digest the information. I think it probably depends person to person. I don't know. But is it diminished when you don't read it if you just listen to it?
Well, I would hope that as long as your attention is on what you're reading, that it's one way of learning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so. I think I think I'm lucky in that. I think I can learn through auditory. I don't know that it's for everyone. I'm
going to be honest, though. If they came out with a paper tomorrow in some scientific journal that said Audible and audiobooks podcasts, worst way to learn, I'd still listen to them, and I still wouldn't read.
Well, it might be the best way.
Absolutely.
There's some people that would argue, I think, that because there's something magical to the spoken word, but there's probably something magical to writing is certainly accesses a different part of the mind. Because it makes you more intentional. It slows you down.
Yeah, it does.
I find that often if it got published, it probably has been through a filter that maybe makes the information in it more valuable.
Right.
But you never know. With a podcast, sometimes you find something that is just as valuable, just as huge of a gem. So
yeah, and you get to hear it. You get to hear the intonation in the voice and the cadence, and and when there's two people, it's conversational. So it's like you're eavesdropping on a good convo. So because when you read a book, unless you know who the book is, like if Morgan Freeman wrote a book, I would read the book in Morgan Freeman's voice. But most of the time, if you don't know the author, you're not familiar with it, you're just reading the words in your own voice.
Yeah.
And so that can be powerful when you hear something really insightful come in your own voice. Then you can internalize that, right?
Yeah.
And also, if you feel like yourself is just your own running consciousness and you're not really tuned into that, then it might be better to hear it from someone else. So I don't know. Pros and cons.
When can we expect your doctorate to be official?
I have to not get fired between now and July 31st, 2020. Then I will graduate in August.
Godspeed, sir. I think you're going to be just fine.
Thank you. So far, so good, but you never know. I might paddle a boat out there and slap a patient and then get...
Hey, he'll probably deserve it.
Yeah. I would... man, some days those patients just make you mad. You're just like, look, just get it together.
Get your shit.
That's new form of psychology. Slap psychology. Just tell them to get it together. Give them a good slap. But no, I'm just kidding.
It's very precise slapping.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like
you wind up like a predetermined amount of pounds per inch.
Evidence-based, statistically
like this is a prescribed
significant.
slap. You're going to turn 45 degrees off center to the right buttocks.
Oh, wow. I was thinking of the face, but the buttocks?
I mean, depends what kind of ailment they have.
Okay, that's true. That's true.
They might need it to the face.
They might need a different slap. Oh, boy.
The wrist, depending.
Well, unless I don't slap a client between now and then. So, yeah.
Sweet, man.
August 2020.
Well, thank you for being a part of this. I think that's probably as good a place as any to wrap it.
Wow.
And
well, thanks
for
super.
Yeah. Thanks. I mean, the information, you always bring a lot of insight. And so I really appreciate that. And everyone should be following you and reading your book when it comes out.
Well, yeah, I don't think I've ever had a chance to talk about my book in long form before. So I'm glad you asked. I'm glad you're willing to dive into it because it's like, this is good practice. Like that's not what I came here thinking I was going to do. And I really appreciate you being able to share your platform with it, sharing your boat with me.
This is the SS Height Drop.
Gosh, SS Height Drop.
I actually have an episode titled that because I like the boat. I've always liked the boat thing.
Oh man.
So yeah, I'd love to, and that's what this is about for sure. This is hopefully my way of giving back in some ways, is to offer an audience to cool people that are doing cool things.
And if you're listening right now, you're on the SS Height Drop with us, and I think you should definitely like, comment, and subscribe, or subscribble, hit the bell for notifications, leave a comment, do whatever you got to do to keep this boat floating.
Thank you so much for saying that. All right. Thank you guys for joining us, and we love you. Peace out.
Peace.